Cloudflare, in a crawling sense, is not one of the 13 root servers that exist in the world that control all of the internet traffic, but they do provide services to them. And I think it really just emphasizes and focuses my mind on how much of the underlying infrastructure that the whole world relies on is actually ultimately controlled by US companies, and the implications of that for for the well-being of people, but the nation's sovereignty.
Welcome to Birding Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we look at whether Australia can play a leading role in imagining a tech future that isn't reliant on either the US or China, with Johanna Weaver from the Tech Policy Design Institute. But first, our regular look at the latest tech news with panellists Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton.
So it has been a week of high diplomacy with more plans than a Soviet Central Committee. The Trump administration's action plan to win the AI race, the Chinese government's AI plan, the UK government's comprehensive plan to bend over for OpenAI, and there's even been a People's AI plan released by the AI Now Institute. So we're going to go deep into all these plans and what they mean to Australia with our special guest and first-time platform pyromaniac, Johanna Weaver from the Tech Policy Design Institute, an independent think tank doing what the sticker on the name suggests. Hello, Johanna.
Hello, great to be here.
And to help us wade through these plans, we are joined by the doyen of contestable legal frameworks, Digital Rights founder and chair, Lizzie O'Shea. Lizzie, hello.
Hello, nice to be here.
And welcoming back the man who can make a cost-benefit analysis, seeing Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Welcome back, Dan.
I'm not sure what you mean by that, Peter, but
I know you've been having a very good week with your paperwork. That's all I know. But first, let's launch into the news. Lizzie, we have a new parliament. I think it is the 47th. How's it going to be different to the 46th?
This is a big question. So for what it's worth, for people who are following at home who maybe want to know how various ministers will carry forward policies that were agreed to under the last parliament, but maybe that minister didn't hold that ministry, for what it's worth, Digital Rights Watch is running a program where we're writing to every relevant minister and seeking their views on various topics, including things like privacy reform as well as AI regulation. And we're going to be publishing those responses on our website. So we've asked ministers from the government, but also representatives from other major parties and from the Teals and some key independents. But it's fair to say that there's a bit of unfinished business after the last parliament, particularly on privacy reform. So obviously a number of recommendations were actioned at the end of last year, including the introduction of a statutory tort. But there remains, I would argue, probably around 100 recommendations that the government's agreed to that haven't yet been implemented. And it looks like we're getting some positive signs from the new Attorney General, Michelle Rowland. This had obviously been a big issue for the previous attorney, but the current attorney was Minister for Communications, so I think she did also pay attention to this issue. But it looks like she's interested in progressing those reforms, and all signs point to that being a priority for her, which is a good sign. There is a lot of time being spent on age verification. There's a new minister, obviously, because communications was vacated by the attorney. So that is Annika Wells. She published the results recently on the consumer survey that the government did. I think it was only about 6 months after that survey was conducted, which found, according to the minister at least, very strong community support for age verification. But if you look into the results, it also shows very strong concerns about privacy and security. So it remains an issue where there's surface level support, but digging a bit deeper, a lot of people, I think, have serious concerns about operationalising it. And also then we've seen arguments about what is and isn't a social media platform, with Google potentially threatening to take legal action if the government seeks to include it in the age verification regime. It's not much longer before that has to be implemented. So I think there's a lot of eyes on how this will work. And we haven't seen very much detail in what kind of tech will be used. So a lot of unanswered questions remain, which I think is probably what most people predicted about that particular policy field, but it does take up a lot of time and energy and square inches of media space. There are some other things that I thought I would just mention. Of course, AI regulation is one of them. We didn't get an AI Act in the last Parliament. We now have a new Minister for Industry, Tim Ayres.
Special guest on burning platforms next week.
Exactly, is going to be a guest. So that's a first good sign, I think, about that minister. But also I think it's fair to say it's probably coming from the perspective of thinking about the rights of workers in this space. The ACTU put out a press release just today, actually, about this issue, calling for greater worker involvement in AI regulation. So though we've had some initial steps towards regulation of AI, there's a long road to go, and it's not clear what that will look like. But one of those steps may be an overarching act, and it could also include other initiatives to give workers greater voice in the rollout of AI, and certainly the ACTU will be pushing for that. And then lastly, there's other things going on as well, including Kate Cheney, the Teal for Perth, put out a private members bill about criminalising AI tools that allow for the creation of child sex abuse material, which actually the criminalisation of Notify apps was something that was recommended by the review of the Online Safety Act, but the government has not yet made clear how it intends to action the recommendations from that review. And I think there's a lot of problems with this. So there's a lot of difficulty, it seems like, with trying to police these kinds of apps. Or what I suppose I would also say is there's some interesting research that came out from Human Rights Watch that found that where Australian children had their images in image generation AI tools, so ones that are just used by the public, not even marketed as Notify apps, calling Human Rights Watch actually called for greater protection of children's privacy to stop this kind of hoovering up of images for this purpose. So it's not even, I think, just a problem with the tech itself, but also the privacy protections over particularly children's data, but everyone's images that might be used in this way. And so the last thing I suppose I'll say is the rollout of the Children's Online Privacy Code is underway. That will come into force and I think improve potential protections in this context. But it remains an issue that the government will have to keep an eye on, because I think it's very popular, sensible policy to figure out how you can try and get these apps off the internet, and it's working out how to effectively regulate that I think might be a challenge. But I think there are lots of opportunities, and we might see that happen given the political strength of those kinds of claims. So it will be a busy Parliament.
So that is a lot going on. I guess the key outtakes is all the key ministers have changed seats. Johanna, is that an opportunity for a new lease of life on reforms that didn't quite get through the last term, or are you concerned at the challenge of rekindling some of these reform proposals?
Oh, look, I think my overarching, I don't know how other people think about this, but it has the feel like it's a first term government in terms of the shift of all of the different ministers and the way that it has landed. So I think I'm really interested, Lizzie, to see what responses you get to the proposition, like to asking people to say, are you going to stick by them? I also think we made quite good progress last Parliament. I know we didn't get the tranche 2 privacy reforms and very much support Lizzie's call that we need those. But I think there was some pretty good progress around things like, digital ID, for example. I think we always talk about what we didn't regulate on artificial intelligence, but we had clear statements that existing law applies, which is a simple thing to say, but actually had a big impact. So we're watching very, very closely. And the privacy indications, the Attorney General made some comments this evening that also are indicating that she's, focused on it. The fact that she was so aggressive in in progressing the age verification for kids on social media. She's not shy in taking on tech companies in this space. So, that's all positives. And I think the biggest question mark is AI regulation.
You convene Friends of Parliamentary Friends of Tech Regulation, which is a niche club, but what's
of
the mood?
Tech policy.
Tech policy. Thank you.
Yes.
And a great group they are. But what do you think the general mood is towards reform within the parliament? Do you feel there's across the party lines enthusiasm to keep pushing, or is there that sort of elephant in the room, which is Trump and the US, that's sort of making people want to go slowly?
Oh, I think for government, they're very conscious of Trump and the US. I think for anyone that isn't in government having to actually deal with that reality, there is a lot of momentum. We are getting so many approaches by parliamentarians saying, this is the issue that I want to focus on. And then you sort of press a little bit more and you don't always get a lot of clarity on what the issue is. But that's also great, because that's why organisations like ours exist, to be able to help bring sort of sensible evidence policy-based discussion to the table. So without question, there is enormous interest in what do we do around artificial intelligence, kids online. These types of issues are absolutely front of mind for politicians.
Dan, what's the one thing you'd like to see movement on this term?
It's going to be pretty boring and predictable, but I think privacy. I mean, we made a really good progress in the first term, and I was pretty dismayed when Dreyfus was moved out of the portfolio. So I just hope that Roland takes up the mantle and or takes the baton and runs with it. There has been some encouraging signs, I think you mentioned at the start, Lizzie. I'm also pretty encouraged, by the way, by Kate Chaney's bill, my member, for what it's worth. The reason I like it is because I think there's been a bit of inertia around AI because we try and regulate the whole thing in one fell swoop, and it feels like, trying to regulate the internet. I mean, it's so big as to be silly, and really AI is going to be in absolutely everything. I know I'm the tech bro. I know that's what I would say, but nonetheless, I think it's true. And I think if we look back in 10 years, AI will have impacted on almost every aspect of the economy and society as well. And therefore, what I like about Kate's bill is that she's picking off a part of it where there's clearly some harms here, and she's going, let's regulate for that. And I think this is going to be the first of or maybe not the first, but sort of an early example of a large number of these reforms that are going to come through. So I hope it's the first of many, and I hope this one goes through.
Yeah, I also think it's a very sensible proposal that has been put forward and quite well thought out. Kate Chaney is one of our parliamentary co-chairs.
Any chance of it getting on the agenda, do you reckon?
Well, watch this space.
Yeah. Well, this is the space to watch. We better push along. Dan, we did gloss over the Cloudflare story in your absence last episode with Toby Walsh, but you want to give it another round of the blocks. Why are you so excited about what the cloud can do to civilizing tech?
Yeah, I listened to last fortnight's conversation with Toby, and it was great that you touched on this, but I think this is huge, or I think at least it has the potential to be huge in potentially really positive ways and also potentially really negative ways. So I wanted to sort of take another lap around it if you'll indulge me. So I think we should probably explain to people what Cloudflare is first and foremost, because I suspect most people won't know. So it's effectively a service that helps keep websites fast and secure online, right? So And it controls, and I'll explain how it does that in a second, but it controls about 20% of the traffic on the internet and a much larger proportion of publishers in my anecdotal experience. So it has really significant power over what people see online. And it does this by acting sort of like a middleman, if you like, between a website and its visitors. So it blocks harmful traffic like hackers and bots that are trying to overload a site. And it stores copies of websites' content on servers sort of around the world. So when someone visits a website that might be out of San Francisco, for example, and let's say they're based where I am tonight in Perth, you're accessing that content on Perth servers as opposed to servers in the US, and so it loads faster and more efficiently and the like. So all of this happens in the background. It's invisible to users, and it keeps websites running safely without each individual website having to invest in this infrastructure themselves. So as you touched on a fortnight ago or thereabouts, on the 1st of July, Cloudflare announced this so-called Content Independence Day. And the announcement is basically that Cloudflare is automatically going to block AI bots from scraping website content unless it explicitly is permitted by that website. So it effectively goes from being a sort of an opt-in where these LLMs can crawl all of these websites at will, irrespective of whether the terms of service of those respective websites allow them to do so, and it turns them off by default. And what it's doing, it's basically saying it's doing this because it's saying that obviously this new model for the internet, or where the internet is going, doesn't really work. Like in the old model, it was dominated by Google primarily, and Google would send you traffic, and that was flawed. I'll come back to that in a way, but at least you got the traffic coming through. Whereas now, when you ask OpenAI or ChatGPT or any of these large language models a question, you typically get those answers within that environment. All the benefit flows to the large language model, and none flow through to the original content creator. So what Cloudflare is launching is this sort of private beta of so-called pay-per-crawl infrastructure. And it means that AI bots must present payment credentials in order to be able to access content. And it's sort of intended as a first step towards a sort of broader content monetization framework where they'll share some of that revenue back with the publishers or the websites or what have you. Now, this is significant for a number of reasons, but I want to make one really important observation here, and that is that they have blocked all of these chatbots from accessing websites, with one exception, and that's Google. And the reason they've done that is because if you block Google's bot from crawling your website, you also block that website's content from appearing in search, and no website can really exist, or no business can really exist online if you do that. So it does give Google this huge sort of unearned anti-competitive advantage over all of these other LLMs, which is a problem in itself. But I think there's a really interesting comparable here with what Google did to establish the ad-supported web some 20 or 25 years ago or thereabouts. So in that model, Google basically said to publishers and websites and everyone else that the deal was, we'll send you traffic, and in addition to sending you that traffic, if you use our ad-supported or our ad infrastructure and show our ads on your website, we'll share revenue with you as part of that. And it seemed like a good deal. Most of the publishers, most of the websites around the world embraced it. They became the largest advertising company off the back of that. And the problem is that they shared such little revenue back with the actual websites that most news publishers went out of business, and it didn't really work, and Google kept a huge lion's share of it. So I think there's a really important lesson here for Cloudflare. So obviously this is really smart business for Cloudflare in doing this, and I think we're likely to see their competitors in Akamai and Fastly and the like doing something similar. But the big question is, are they going to share enough of the revenue that they are collecting off the back of this with the publishers and the websites that they are allowing access to in order to sustain have a more sustainable digital economy? I hope they do. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical given the example of Google in the former, but what does the rest of the panel think?
So are you saying, and I'll throw to Lizzie in a sec, but just so I understand it, are you saying that they could almost become a competition to the LLMs because they're not allowing them to crawl, and instead they're collecting the copyrighted material?
Not so much a competition, but more of a toll gate, if you like. So if you want to access, I know I see the whole world through publishing, but if you want to access The Guardian, for example, where I used to work, if you want to access The Guardian's content, then you have to basically have a microtransaction set up whereby you're paying to crawl The Guardian's content in order to be able to give an answer back to the publisher, and they share revenue on that basis. I mean, by the way, one of the reasons this is so genius is that I've been calling for something like this from publishers around the world.
It's genius because you've been calling for it.
Yeah, clearly. But the main problem, right, is that if all of the publishers got together and did this in unison, it would be anti-competitive. That'd be by definition collusion conduct, right? So this gets around that in a fairly elegant way, and I hope that all the publishers around the world keep it off by default and end up negotiating better terms than they've currently got with these large language models.
Does it circumvent the competition regulation? I mean, I think it. I mean, obviously, Google's integration of its ads business with other parts of its business is now the subject of litigation, right? Like here, my day job is a lawyer at Morris Blackburn. We're involved in a class action against Google around these exact issues, but also out of the US, right? So it's not like there's been no consequences for Google, but as a litigator, I totally understand that it's often too late, even if it is effective, because even if you're successful in that litigation, they've established their power in the marketplace. Like it's better to prevent than cure through litigation, right? But what I would say is I think the vice that you're describing that might eventuate in this context, you can see how it's very tempting. It's an elegant solution because Cloudflare sits at the right level of the stack to be able to do that kind of collective enforcement of crawlers, but it is very tempting then to be an overcharger for that service, right? Because there's no competition for it. The question, I suppose, is whether competition regulators will be ready to go or too permissive and allow that kind of dominant behavior to shape the marketplace. So it's not like there's no tools available, or it's not as though there's no consequences for this, but I think the pace has to be quicker if we're going to see a diverse market or protect all sorts of different organizations from having greater control over how web crawlers make use of text on their website. Like it is very promising because it's the kind of structural solution you sort of need, but it also has to then be regulated for in a way that protects from the companies that sit at those levels pursuing their own self-interest, which is inevitable when a company like this, which is really providing infrastructure for the web, is privately owned, right? Like I think now we have to turn our gaze to competition regulators and think about this as a competition problem, maybe as well as thinking about it as a copyright privacy problem too when it comes to the actual functionality of the crawlers.
I guess the interesting thing is it's a different center of power and leverage. Like, do you have a position on crawlers, Johanna?
Not so much on crawlers, but I think the point that Lizzie is making about where a company sits in the stack and who controls that company is a really, really interesting one. And increasingly, we're seeing Australia wake up to the fact of how much of that stack, and I mean, even something as basic as the domain name system, which Cloudflare in a crawling sense is not for one of the 13 root servers that exist in the world that control all of the internet traffic, but they do provide services to them. And I think it really just emphasizes and focuses my mind on how much of the underlying infrastructure that the whole world relies on is actually ultimately controlled by US companies, and the implications of that for the well-being of people, but the nation's sovereignty. And to be honest, there's a little bit of mea culpa in this, because there are many countries in the world who've been pointing this out to countries like Australia for a long time, saying this is really, we're not comfortable with the US dominance of this. And when we were in alignment with US values, that we were quite comfortable with that.
Back in the good old days.
Exactly. And now we're not. I think there's some countries out there that are being quite gracious by not looking at us and saying, I told you so. So I sort of defer to Dan and Lizzie on the Cloudflare point, but I think on a broader, it's putting the magnifying glass on some of the other pieces of infrastructure that are.
If only someone had written an article about that, we might get to that in a little while. Before we do, I do want to draw all of your attention to the case of the Satanistic Chat Bots. What are they? Atlantic reporter Lila Schroff went down a ChatGPT rabbit hole to see what their prediction machines will serve up if given the wrong prompts. After a tip-off from a reader, Lila asked the chatbot to create a ritual offering to Molech, who is the Canaanite god associated with child sacrifice. As Dan likes to say, stay with me here. She then asked the bot to give practical advice on the best ways to slash her wrists, argue the case for murder, and pass salutations to Satan. And it seems the backdoor emerged because it came in as a historical/cultural query and then bypassed the obviously flimsy controls built into the model. And this is ChatGPT. It's not something that somebody sort of made up on the back of their desk. It also highlights the extent that users' wishes are weighted against their safety. And I think it asks big questions about how these flaws will play out now the chat bots have been given the power to reign across the web via OpenAI's exciting new agentic tools. And into this conundrum drops Trump's tech bro love letter, which declares woke AI an enemy of the state and an impediment to the race to win AI, whatever winning AI actually is. So while this might just seem like a fun little culture war, it feels like it has real world consequences, not the least for the devil. So, Dan, is this just a more compelling case for algorithmic transparency? I know this seems quaint term from the early 2022s, or is this a burning platform?
Algorithmic transparency, it sounds so hopeful as to be ludicrous now, doesn't it? I'll make a couple of observations about this. So what I think that first example demonstrates, right, is the real problem of these large language models, because, whether it's prompt injection or sort of hacking, I guess, by another term or more general term, previously, if you wanted to try and hack into a system, you had to have a fairly high level of technical expertise in order to do so. Whereas in this scenario, because they are all effectively programming based on common language or based on language, anybody with enough time on their hands and will on their hands is going to be able to find ways around the system.
A programming solution, yeah.
And I think so. That's the thing, that everyone's a programmer now. Like literally, you've got however many
prompt is a program. You're right.
On the planet are able to program now, and some of those people are going to have nefarious ends, and therefore the number of people, the sheer volume of people that are going to be trying to do these sorts of things is going to explode, and we're going to see some massive problems. And I'm not sure there is a solution for that. One remedy, I mean, there really is only a handful of models now which are winning, right? So OpenAI is clearly one of them, Google Gemini, Anthropic on the US side, and maybe even Grok if Elon keeps pouring money into it. We still don't really know what the size of their safety teams are. I mean, let alone algorithmic transparency, none of them really tell us much. I mean, from what we can gather, it looks like Anthropic and Google seem to be taking safety the most seriously, but we don't really know that either. I would have thought at the very least we could start with some kind of obligation on these companies to at least declare what their safety measures are, and then have regulators determine whether that's adequate or not, and journalists hold them to account. I thought that would be a pretty good start. That solves one problem. The problem it doesn't solve, though, is the open source or open weights models that you have with DeepSeek out of China and all the other Chinese models that are coming, and also Meta with their Llama model. And the problem with them is people can download those weights and then they can do nefarious ends on their own local infrastructure, and no one will be any the wiser, and who knows what's going to come out of that. It's not a very optimistic take on things, unfortunately.
But Lizzie, it feels like any sort of limits on this is exactly what the Trump AI policy aims to, outlaw. Make it, Grok's untouchable, even though it's now spawning Mecha Hitler. But that's just free speech, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it was Alondra Nelson who we talked to recently on this podcast, who talked about how there's this, line coming out of the White House that we shouldn't regulate AI for a decade or whatever, but there are a lot of ways in which it's regulated. It's protected in all how their models are developed, and the data they are taking or expropriating or using is also protected. It's a regulated market. It's just a question of how it's regulated, right? Like that is, I think, the place to start on that point. I do wonder about how you, if transparency is not possible or not able to be regulated for in this instance, and even if it were, would it solve some of these problems? I wonder about it. But the other thing that comes to mind is the high levels of use of something like OpenAI's products or other chatbots probably for therapy purposes, like how the majority of people are using these tools. Like the small number of people who are using them in terrible ways is one problem we have to address, but also the more pedestrian ways in which people are using these products in ways that are potentially harmful is another. And I wonder what the answer is to that. Like, I keep thinking about when I first had a baby, like one of the things the maternal child health nurse says is, don't Google if something's going wrong with your baby. And when you do inevitably not follow that advice, there is a whole lot of resources that are developed by the Royal Children's Hospital to deal with stuff, like to flood it with good content. And it's not a solution to having bad content there, but it is one method. And is there a way in which we can find ways to give people pathways for finding safer access to things that they clearly are using these products for? Like, should we be trying to find ways to make counselling or therapy more accessible so that there isn't this temptation to go and use a product that is not at all designed for that purpose? And I think that's also what we should use this period for, identifying why or what gaps there are that we have to try and fill, not just what do we have to stop happening, but like, how do we create better alternatives for things that people are actually screaming out for? And I don't know. I mean, like, I don't think that's a regulatory answer, but I don't think we can just say to people or find a regulatory solution that stops this use, other than maybe things like age verification or whatever. Like, there's potential tech tools, I suppose, or tech responses. But I actually think also we have to take the challenge that's been put to us by what we're seeing emerge in the experimentation with these products is the best I can offer at this point as a hot take.
So I do want your take on this, Johanna, but maybe in the context of the broader discussion we're going to have around your paper and your work. So, and, it doesn't need to stay around satanistic chatbots, but the broader idea of different models around AI, and I think what's really interesting about the article that you and Zoe have written in the last issue of Australian Foreign Affairs, the special Tech Wars edition, is that you don't just fall over and say there's the American model and the Chinese model and that's it, take your choice, folks, because both choices are pretty stuck. So talk a little bit around the paper, and then we might sort of and I think the other thing, interestingly, is that you're framing it as a discussion really around diplomacy and your background as a diplomat. So maybe give us a little bit of a background of your journey to get to the point where you're putting out this paper, and then what diplomacy has taught you about charting a path forward between two pretty unappealing options that are staring us at the moment.
Yeah, so I guess like a potted history. So I left government to establish the Tech Policy Design Institute's predecessor about 4 years ago, and I left as finish up my term as Australia's chief cyber negotiator at the United Nations. So I spent a lot of time negotiating with Russia and China, but also the US, and have a pretty real, clear-eyed perspective on what actually is possible at the international agreement level to get across the line. The context of what we're looking at, and actually part of the thing that led me to reach out to you, Pete, was in the episode before last, you were talking about Canada and the fact that it had rolled over on its digital services tax, and you said, Lizzie, the lawyers will always have an answer. And I actually think in this instance, the diplomats have an answer, right? Because we're not going to be able to respond to a world where you have massive advances in artificial intelligence technologies and a Trump administration doing all of the unpredictable, coercive things that it is doing by ourselves. We have to do that in good company. And so, the question is, what is the best way for us to be able to act in concert with other countries? And that's kind of the premise that we started with the paper, is saying, this is not a case as the US is retreating that we have to accept that China can fill that space. Actually, Australia is very, very well positioned to fill the vacuum in very particular ways. We're not going to be a great power, but we can actually step in and fill that vacuum. And we put forward several areas where we think are ripe for that.
So let's step this out before we get to the solution. So it's almost like a Goldilocks thing. So let's start with the US model embedded in Trump's AI statement this week. What future does that sort of set us down?
Well, can I actually do it a little bit more bluntly and put it like, so the US AI plan sitting next to the Chinese AI plan?
Yeah,
and
I was going to give you the two, but yes, any way you'd like to formulate your thinking, because mine is muddled.
Yeah. So I think, there's a great graph, there's a great table that I can send you a link to, which is sort of comparing at a very high level the two plans that have come out. If you look at it from a very, very high level, you now have the US that is saying from a sort of foundational philosophy perspective, it's about innovation, it's about the market leading, it's about democratic values, about democratic values. But that's what the US is selling, right? China, in their strategy, is selling, we want AI as a public good. We want it to be secure, controllable, and sovereign. That's the sort of starting leverage point for them. Look at things like their approach to green artificial intelligence. You've got the Chinese approach pushing for sustainable AI, energy efficient infrastructure. And you have the US model saying, we don't want any radically climate dogma. Climate is not a core pillar of AI policy. On compute, you have China saying we want shared compute power. We want this to be a distributed resource. In the US, they're saying we want it to be about domestic scaling. We want to control, and some trusted partners get to have that. You put those two models next to each other, which one is more attractive if you're not China or the US or a very, very close ally of either one of those? The Chinese model is actually a much more attractive proposition to most of the rest of the world who want to use artificial intelligence to solve real world problems. Right? They want to use it to educate populations, feed populations, and to address climate change or deal with tangible issues. And that is a challenge for Australia, because if you have tech that is authoritarian tech, you're encoding authoritarian values, and we're going, if we simply accept and cede that
But
space.
Which tech is authoritarian?
Well, very good question. Very good question, right? I mean, we used to have a clear answer to that. But I guess the point that I would say is the countries are looking to Australia to say, hey, Australia, you can be leading in energy efficient artificial intelligence that is solving real world problems. So let's focus our national capability in that direction. Australia, we're looking to you for leadership in the space of responsible and safe AI as a competitive advantage that drives a productivity dividend for Australia. And so there's lots of advantages for Australia in this area if we actually are brave enough to recognise that the world has changed dramatically, and that space is there.
If the two models, one is, and the other thing that I noted in some of the commentary on the Chinese AI strategy is it's a plan for governance, not for world domination. Why wouldn't you just say this is a better model and just shift the allegiance on tech rather than building a third way? Like, why wouldn't you?
It's not, I don't think it's necessarily about building a third way, but I think there are countries that are, I've spent probably at least the last decade talking with people who work in governments in our region, right? And they are equally skeptical of the Chinese as they are of the US and as they are of the Australians. And they're not looking to choose, right? But they want to ensure that they can exercise their sovereign power as a nation. And without getting super nerdy about it, that's the foundation of international relations. The Treaty of Westphalia is saying states can do what you want to do within your own borders and we'll respect that. And you agree to enter into the international system by giving up certain parts of your sovereignty. And I think this idea that countries, we say, that countries don't want to choose between the US and China. And actually, I think it's much more about countries want choice And if Australia can offer a choice that is a choice that doesn't come with all of the strings that come attached to Chinese tech, but likewise the potential increasing strings attached to US tech, countries will take it. And that's an economic opportunity for Australia if we are prepared and can move quickly enough, because the vacuum won't exist for very long.
But what are they taking, Johanna? Like, because we don't have a model here, right? Like, we don't. This really is a US, or I'm talking about the large language models now. This really is a US and China race, right? There's no one else in that race. I mean, help me understand. Like, how can Australia lead when we don't actually have the foundational tech to offer the world that those two countries do? I mean, I'll come back to my cynicism around China's perspective on this in a second, but maybe just if you could answer that question, that would be helpful.
So I am also deeply cynical about the Chinese motivations for this. So please don't take this as me advocating for the Chinese perspective. Sure. But what I'm saying is the Chinese perspective is deeply attractive to other countries who are making a choice at the moment, and that is something that we need to combat.
If it was genuine, by the way, it's a much better system. I question whether it is, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah, very good. So I think there's two things we can do. One is we can actually engage with other countries to apply pressure to shape the technology that is being given to us, and that is through something that we're calling the Interoperable Tech Regulation Initiative. Mm-hmm. So that's one really powerful way we can. And you look at, for example, one thing you can say is the focus of Trump's anti-woke AI plan. If nothing else, it's a clear indication of the power of government procurement, right? So what about if the Australian government stepped up and made some statements like that, but did it in a way that said, we are shaping responsible AI. We are, the largest purchaser of technology in Australia. Let's use our purchasing power to shape positive outcomes in the technology. So there's things like that. There is investment in artificial intelligence technologies. And here there's so much focus, Dan, on LLMs and these types of things. But often the challenges to solve the technology that is required to solve the problems that countries in our region are thinking about and dealing with don't necessarily require frontier AI models. It requires better technology than countries currently have access to. So let's not, it's kind of like we're walking around saying mine's bigger than yours, as opposed to saying, well, is it actually useful? Like, how about we focus on what's useful? And I think that's an area. Of course, we need to incentivize that. We need to build that capability. It needs to be a choice that we make as a nation, but it's a really strategic choice that we can make to cultivate that industry. And then, of course, I think there's a lot we can do internationally on the regulatory front with power in numbers, because otherwise we'll just be picked off as well. So that's another really important area.
Isn't one of the problems, though, Johanna, that you kind of diplomatically cover in your paper, that one of the challenges or the reasons why Australia may not take this opportunity, and for what it's worth, as a side note, I think it's an interesting reference that you've got in there talking about, for example, Doc Everett's role in developing some of the key human rights instruments and the establishment of the UN, that we played as a middle power a significant role between two major world powers in negotiating the international legal foundations in the post-World War II environment. But isn't one of the problems we face in this moment that Australia has this legacy relationship with the US, that it seems like it's going to be quite slow to shift diplomatically out of that mindset? Like, it's quite clear now that the US is an unreliable partner on a range of different fronts. They're very mercurial. Like, people watch the imposition of sanctions on, the one that comes to mind for me is the ICC, which means that, Microsoft can't sell their tech to them anymore. And, how destabilizing it is if a very powerful executive authority takes a dislike to you, and that could happen to you. Do you know what I mean? And all the tech infrastructure products that you rely on at all different levels of the stack, they're often US companies, that can have a huge impact on your capacity to participate in the digital life. And the fact that the Australian government appears to be quite slow to shift towards, particularly its neighbours regionally, that mentality of wanting a choice when the key ally that we've had for so long is actually forcing governments to make choices, right? Like, is that one of the challenges
embedding it under
that we won't...
AUKUS as well, just quietly?
Totally. So isn't that one of the problems, that maybe diplomatically we're not ready to make the shift, or to open ourselves up to an alternative and then continuing to have the US as our major ally?
Yeah, so I think, and we're pretty clear about this in the article, the biggest challenge to Australia taking on this type of leadership role is the mind shift that is required for us to do that. And to do that, we have to admit that the US is no longer the leader of the free world. I'm not saying that the US is not a major global power. I'm not saying that the US should not continue to be and will continue to be a major partner and our most important security partner. But we have to accept that the rest of the world certainly no longer sees the US as the leader of the free world. And that really changes the way that Australia should be engaging and projecting our own power and influence in our region, but also globally. And I think that's the biggest challenge to this. I actually think that countries are looking to Australia, looking to us to step up. We have that middle power diplomacy track record, going right back to Doc Evans, the writing of the UN Charter, these foundational human rights documents, as you said. But we also are one of the few countries that's really engaged internationally on in the international system on things like, Australia was the country that was holding the pen on the negotiations on international law applies to state conduct in cyberspace. We have been, right in there on cybercrime, international cybercrime negotiations on, the AI ethics frameworks before AI ethics was cool. We have the reputation as a country who brings with it not just that we punch above our weight, but that we have weight when we punch in this space. And so countries are looking to us to do this. And the question is, will we actually step into the space? And I think there is a possibility that we will. I'm what does an optimist call a pessimist? A realist with all the facts. I'm not here blindly naive, but I think there is a real opportunity for us, and it's a commercial and economic opportunity as much as it is sort of a moral obligation for us to be stepping into the space.
So, as a counterpoint, we mentioned it before, the British government doing big agreement with OpenAI that basically says we will work with you to work out how to use your technology. That seems to be an opposite model to the sort of framework you're suggesting.
Yeah, again though, I think we're obsessed with LLMs. There is so much more that this technology can deliver for our country, and to really solve problems, as opposed to give us more sophisticated chatbot. And I know OpenAI is more than an LLM. But I think the conversation has become so narrow that we're not actually looking. It's kind of to Lizzie's point about how can we actually use AI to improve therapy, as opposed to have people looking to ChatGPT in order to have therapy. There are really exciting advances that we can have in things like robotics or biotech and all of these other areas, and we keep coming back to focusing just on the LLMs.
Isn't that part of the criticism, though, of, say, the UK's plan, that the preoccupation with LLMs is actually one of policymakers? Why is the whole government orienting towards how can we regulate to make your product profitable, when in fact they should be looking at in a neutral way at all different kinds of tech that's available, and what, according to human need, maybe is the most urgent problems we should solve, and elevating that tech? Isn't that the preoccupation of policymakers, not just commentators or media as well?
100%. And I think so. We have a report coming out next week which is using the analogy of a game of Tetris, right? So currently we have a bunch of ministers. A lot of focus at the moment is on the Tetris block that is called productivity, right? You have people pulling down the productivity block. There are other blocks like national capability or people and the planet. You have literally these silos of directions that are being pulled. And if you imagine basically like the worst possible Tetris game, where it's like kind of clumbled on top of each other, that's kind of where we're going to end up, because we are looking at this so narrowly. And unless we actually create a structure that allows us to not just talk about LLMs, but also not just talk about productivity, not just focus on one, whatever the hot topic issue is, and to bring a cohesive approach to the way we're doing this, we're actually not going to lay the foundations to get the diffusion of artificial intelligence technologies right, as opposed to just how do we do it the quickest and fastest with the biggest thing that is being given to us. And so I 100% agree with what you're saying, Lizzie, and a big part of what we're trying to do at the Tech Policy Design Institute is broaden that discussion and say we should be looking at this much more comprehensively, and with a much stronger evidence base.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty convinced by your argument that this makes sense and this approach makes sense and this is what Australia should be doing.
Have you ever said that before, Dan? I'm like, I almost fell off my chair.
Lizzie changed my mind a month ago on age verification for what it's worth. That was also a first.
Yeah.
So there you go. But I'll just undermine everything I've just said now with what I'm about to say. So
there's a but coming.
There's a but. I guess the thing is that it feels like, particularly if you coming back to where we started this conversation, right, and the different AI policies of China and the US. I worry that Australia does this and we act, we lead a collective group of nations to try and get some of these benefits that you're talking about. And in the meantime, the US and China are still just running a million miles an hour. And the US in particular is basically saying, no guardrails, let's go. And the reason they're saying that, I mean, I know lots of other people are making this observation. There's no great insight, but I think it's important to acknowledge the reason the US has done this, right, is because Trump and the US have become convinced by this notion of exponential AI, and the first one to get to something close to superintelligence or AGI or whatever term you want to use, this then becomes this jumping off point where no one can possibly catch up. Yeah. And if that's right, who cares what Australia is doing? Because it's going to, and I think you see that in the different policy choices, right? So the US is leading at the moment, is leading China. And so of course China's calling for this sort of more kind of collegial kind of approach where there's more government control over these sort of things. Whereas the US is going, if we win this, we win the world. So let's just go at them.
But it's just hyper-capitalism dressed as tech, isn't it? Like it's
but on steroids, right? I think the scale.
But the whole notion of a race is, it's your question, Johanna, not mine.
So I think the first thing is clearly, I mean, the Eric Schmidt AI has been underhyped TED Talk, which is kind of, I think, the origin of a lot of this. If people haven't watched it, you should watch it just for it's such a interesting cultural experience to watch it. But I think the premise of the crux of your question, Dan, is if that is right. Right. Yep. And I don't think I buy into the fact that is right. I don't think this is a zero-sum game. And I also think that Australia here also has an important role to play. So I think people are very reluctant or very pessimistic about the fact that we are ever going to get any kind of agreement of constraint between the US and China on AI unless there is some major catastrophic thing that happens, right? But if you actually look back on the history of major international agreements, those international agreements are usually negotiated in times of heightened tension when you have a mutual desire to constrain between great powers. I don't think we're quite yet at the point we are at a mutual desire to constrain because, as you say, Dan, the US is still winning. But you have things like DeepSeek as a wake up call, but also I think just the compute efficiency that is coming out of these Chinese models. I actually am far more optimistic that we will end up in a situation of a mutual desire to constrain, and there Australia is a country that really can be engaging to both apply pressure and negotiate, because we have the street cred. We have actually negotiated the agreements in this space, whether it's international law and cyberspace, whether it's the quiet negotiations that Minderoo did, that they've sort of started to quietly publicize around the AI nuclear agreement between US and China. Australia was actually at the core of that agreement as well, right? So we have this quiet diplomatic presence that is there, and I think we are not the pessimism that it is not possible because things are getting tense. That's not how international agreements work. When things get tense, that's actually when the diplomats can do something useful if we engage. And so, part of this is also a plea for the Australian foreign policy community, who, I'm talking to and engaging with, is to say, guys, we actually can have impact in this space, and let's step up.
And how does that go down?
It depends on who you're talking to. I mean, to be honest, the fact that the Australian Foreign Affairs has done an issue that is dedicated to tech issues in and of itself is a victory for me. The fact that they are recognising this as a core foreign policy issue is a positive indication. The cyber ambassador, we were the first country to have a cyber ambassador, and we're about to have the third cyber ambassador appointed. So Brendan Dowling, who's the outgoing cyber ambassador. So, I think a lot of it will depend on who the incoming cyber ambassador is and how much of sort of a mandate they're given on this front.
And it sits pretty comfortably next to Hugh White's quarterly essay, which is also questioning that idea, like America in retreat, like why are we, putting our lot in AUKUS? And so I do think there's a parallel between the defence challenge and the technology challenge at the moment. And if we make the wrong decisions, we get tied into evading power with both of them.
Yeah. Exactly. And, I really don't want what we're saying to be misinterpreted as saying we need to turn away from the US towards China. That's not what we're arguing. We're saying this is a space, the vacuum that is being created by the US. There is real space for Australia to step into this vacuum. When it comes to AI or central bank digital currency, or pick your issue, Australia actually has done the work over decades to put ourselves into this position. Let's not cede the space to China.
But also, if the Chinese model is sound, there's no, and it's not trying to own the broad model, not the language model, but the theory of shared, smaller, less energy burn. Where is the downside in building off that?
So I think the Chinese model from an energy efficiency perspective is something that we should all be leaning into and all should be learning from. But I think, like Dan, I hold a lot of skepticism about the true motivations behind the Chinese governance models. The Chinese, for example, advocate quite strongly for the UN to have a big role in the regulation of artificial intelligence. Now, people might say, of course, we want the UN to be involved in these, but if the only people that have a voting right in the UN are countries, and I would be deeply uncomfortable if we're ceding this space and not having civil society, the tech community having a say in how these technologies are unfolding. So there's a lot of devil in the detail around the Chinese proposals, but on the energy front, I think that is something that we all should be learning from and leading into.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that we have to also orient towards our neighbours, and what they're asking for is for choices, as you were saying, Johanna. And I suppose I worry a bit about our credibility with some of our neighbours geographically as well. Like, we may have that track record in international settings, but I do wonder whether there's enough goodwill among our geographic neighbours to engage meaningfully on this topic, especially leaving it so late. Do you have any observations about that? Like, part of it is about being a negotiator between these two big powers, but do you think we have the credibility with our geographic neighbours to be influential in the way that you would kind of hope for some of the solutions in your paper to come to fruition?
Yeah, I think we do, but I think the window is closing. So, for example, let's take the Pacific. The biggest national security challenge that the Pacific faces is climate change. The Pacific is crying out for the application of advanced artificial intelligence models to help them with climate change modeling to predict, which islands they need to move people off, where they should be set, where they should be building. It's an existential crisis for these countries. And if Australia can actually really pragmatically help, first of all, we have amazing data resources, and if we can then apply compute power to help these countries to be able to solve those very practical problems. And we do not need frontier AI models to do a lot of that, right? A lot of it is just connecting the data to the compute. Then, yes, I think we still do have credibility. But the thing is, we have to actually listen to what these countries are asking for. And if we don't, China will give it to them, right? And that is what China is good at, is saying, okay, you want that, we'll give you this. And of course, later down the track, there's other conversations that come, and that's what we want to avoid. But right now, if these countries are literally making decisions about which islands are going underwater and which ones are they going to actually physically defend those islands, and they're asking for help and we're not giving that help, well, then there is a credibility issue. So I think, yes, I think we have that credibility, but I think the window is increasingly closing.
That's great. Look, thank you for taking us through that really deep thinking, Johanna. We'll put a link. I don't know if it's online or you need to actually go out and buy an actual copy of the
it is
Foreign
online.
Affairs Journal. Yeah, okay, that's great. So we'll put a link in as well. We're actually only off for a week because we've got our special interview with the Industry Minister, Tim Ayres, next Tuesday, where we're going to put him under the Burning Platform spotlight. But thanks for tonight, Lizzie, Dan, Johanna, and we'll see you in 7 days.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on July 29 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.